Youth Development as an Act of Healing from Intergenerational Trauma. Understanding Substance Abuse in Aboriginal Communities. A presentation by Karina Irwin. Intergenerational trauma is defined as the transmission of historical oppression, creating negative impact on the health and well-being of the younger generations. The Aboriginal Healing Foundation in Canada created a literature review in 2016 outlining plans for interventions that will be effective and gaps in research for understanding intergenerational trauma's effect on Aboriginal youth. Some solutions presented were to offer cultural identity as a tool for healing and empowerment and integrate healthcare systems with Aboriginal traditions and healing. How does intergenerational trauma relate to addiction and mental illness? Addiction is a medical condition which spans across social determinants such as race, class, gender, and geopolitical location. According to the WHO, at least 13 million people worldwide suffer from addiction, but Indigenous communities suffer far more negative health outcomes. In regards to alcohol consumption, studies have shown that twice as many white Australians drink than Indigenous Australians do. However, Aboriginal drinkers are twice as likely to report harm caused by alcohol use than white Australians do, are more than twice as likely to binge drink, and are 5 times more likely to die alcohol-related deaths. These disparities point towards lack of access to adequate health care, social isolation, and I believe, intergenerational trauma. According to a report from WHO, Aboriginal communities exist outside of the 50 kilometers of coastline where the majority of the Australian population resides, and are statistically considered the most disadvantaged population, both economically, as they earn an average of only 55% of what white Australians do, and for health outcomes, due to their susceptibility to chronic disease and addiction. This is where the intervention to address intergenerational trauma comes into play. Historically, Aborigines were killed off, removed from their land, sexually abused, and children were taken from their families and put into schools to learn Western culture. The theory of intergenerational trauma states that this shared history continues to affect both people and systems in the form of structural violence. Aboriginal people need to have the right to establish, develop, and manage healthcare systems that are culturally appropriate and reflect ancient tradition. Moreover, it is important to heal from the ground up to break this cycle. This means implementing a youth development model to grow a generation of empowered Aboriginal youth. Aside from alcohol abuse, methamphetamine abuse has recently increased in Aboriginal communities. Community health workers are looking for ways to address the recent problem with this drug, which is highly addictive and can cause users to become violent. According to a study conducted in 2009, most people began using meth in their teen years, some as early as 12. Since substance abuse is said to be intergenerational, the rise in meth use in youth is cause for concern. Meth use, which is also a public health concern for North American Indigenous communities, is said to be a problem in 1 in 50 people in rural Australia. According to drug and alcohol counselors working in rural Indigenous communities, the poverty, unemployment, and systemic racism were what allowed meth abuse to flourish. What's more is in rural communities with little to no industry, lack of employment creates institutionalized poverty. Couple that with addiction, and the meth manufacturing quickly becomes a fast and lucrative industry. This further feeds the prison and policing systems, which create a cycle that seems indestructible. Aboriginal communities need to take back their health. This cycle is in dire need of destruction. In order to heal, post-colonial governments must first fully acknowledge that they have failed to provide health and wellness interventions for the people most needed. Aboriginal communities need to take back their health and do this by being in charge of building their own policies and creating their own systems. Commonwealth governments must recognize the ancient knowledge in First World nations' understanding of health and well-being. All of these issues are undeniably interconnected. Colonialism with poverty, poverty with addiction, addiction with depression, and depression with disempowerment. Because of this, Indigenous groups worldwide struggle with high rates of mental illness and suicide. In Australia, news media reports that suicide has been considered a major public health concern in Aboriginal areas, where young men are the highest at risk in the country. This study states that the reason for this has largely to do with the fact that educational and employment opportunities are limited. The youth development model suggests that youth are capable of healthy decision-making and awareness of their own lives, not powerless beings who need their paths decided for them by adults. Since research suggests that substance abuse begins in adolescence, interventions should be made during this time or even before. Since trauma and addiction are both intergenerational, youth will need to be supported in creating their own roadmaps to healing and to break this cycle. Waralapili Youth Development or Aboriginal Corporation is an organization that recognizes the need for programs which train young people, age 5 to 25, in skills they will find useful for their lives. This is to create empowerment in their lives early on, in order to reduce incidents of substance abuse and possible violence or delinquent actions. Considering that news media outlets have attributed lack of education and employment major factors contributing to substance abuse and suicide, this seems like a useful intervention. Organizations that wish to assist Indigenous youth in empowerment will have to continue to work from the ground up, consider intergenerational trauma, institutional poverty, racism, and the way these things feed into addiction and mental illness when creating and supporting successful youth development programs.